See, obviously, credit where it's due. I think it's an absolutely fantastic result for the Labour Party, and of course many people your side of the fence, and I'm sure you too, are delighted with that result. But when I sit there and I hear that you've got 400 odd seats on just 30% of the vote, we've got a turnout that was 60%. Do you really feel that that's a strong result?
Look, we have the electoral system that we have, and this is a stunning victory for the Labour Party, and it's partly confidence and endorsement of Labour, but it's also a massive rejection for the Conservative Party. But I acknowledge the turnout was low. Actually, the last time the turnout was this low was 2001. What's 2001 got in combination with today? An expectation of a massive Labour victory, and that does depress the turnout. But, you know, the key to this will be Labour delivering in office, and I think we can do that.
Yeah, I mean, where I'm from, Hull, one of the seats there got elected on a turnout of 41%. I'm talking about Hull East, or East Hull as we would call it, 41%. I mean, I don't know if that's the lowest in the country, but it's certainly one of them. That means like 60% of the electorate there didn't turn out.
Well, you have the right to vote, but not an obligation to vote. I rather agree with Olivia. My reading of it would be there wasn't great enthusiasm for any of the parties. I mean, I should start by also saying congratulations to Bill and the Labour Party. Democracy requires losers' consent. And I think far too often the team that's been beaten finds 1,000,001 reasons why the result was unfair or whatever. The Labour Party have won this fair and square. With that said, their victory is colossal but fragile. 34% of the vote. You know, imagine they don't have a particularly popular time in office, and in 5 years' time they've lost 5 or 6% of that vote. Then they're in real trouble. It's possible, I think, in today's politics that whilst if you get a bit more popular, you can double your number of seats. If you get a bit less popular, you can halve your number of seats, or in the Conservative Party's case, lost 2/3 of them. I think those sort of swings and results are actually going to be the norm in politics going forward. It's not going to be a stable thing in which we just look at a handful of swing seats. I think most of the country's on the table now.
I want to know what you think about this. Did you stay up and watch it? And if you did as well, which of the seats were your kind of moments that made you go, oh my gosh, look at this, didn't see that coming? Which ones were you particularly happy about? Which ones were you particularly unhappy about? And how do you feel about the conversation that we're just having here in terms of the turnout? How do you get people to engage better or more with this system?
Well, I think part of the problem is, and I would say it, wouldn't I, but I think the Tories have trashed politics and government over the last 14 years. The lies, the chaos and division. And
well, if that's the case, then you would have had a massive turnout on behalf of you to get rid of them, but we didn't. We had a low turnout.
But the problem, Michelle, is that what they've done, the lies of Johnson, the chaos of Liz Truss, it infects all parties so that people's reaction is, you're all the same. Now, the challenge for Labour, and that's where I think Keir's speech outside of Downing Street was really important, you know, public service, commitment to delivery.
I'm going to play a bit of that Starmer speech in a second, by the way. We'll just get that queued up, ready to go. But
and delivery in government. Now, if we can do that, then I think we do have a sustainable coalition. What I was struck by, looking at some of the polls yesterday, 22% of Labour's vote were people voting tactically for the Labour Party. So there was a real determination to get the Tories out. But if we start delivering, if we bring economic growth, if we start the major house building programme, I think we can keep that coalition together in a way that the Tory coalition that was assembled by Boris Johnson at the last general election was just unsustainable.
Do you accept that then, that essentially it was the behaviour of your lot so bad that's now disengaged people across the population more broadly?
I think the post-mortem for the Conservative Party is going to take quite a long time. And I fear it's going to be pretty bitter as well. There's a large number of people that fingers of blame can be pointed at, and I would think when any party goes through a traumatic result like this, it needs to try and go through the so-called 5 stages of grief pretty rapidly. Otherwise, we are likely to be thrown into a leadership election in which everybody will just scream and shout at each other, and it will just be a question of the blame game. So I hope there's a proper post-mortem. It is very difficult to stay in office after 14 years, right? No party's won 5 elections in a row in our lifetimes. So I think defeat was always on the cards. But it is a very severe defeat that raises a large number of questions. I think the first of those is how the Reform parties managed to take so many votes, which I think otherwise, in, if you like, normal times, would have gone into the Conservative column. That wouldn't have been enough to have beaten the Labour Party, but it would have mitigated the scale of defeat.
In about just shy of 100 seats.
That's right. Yeah,
which is remarkable.
It is remarkable. So it's
party like
I've tipped my hat to Bill and his party. The same to the Reform Party, and the electoral system does not favour them at all. They've had to get. I mean, they've got within spitting distance of the Conservatives and won only 5 seats, and the Conservatives won 121. So there's an awful lot of questions to be asked, I think, about the Conservative Party. Not so much, what it did wrong, but how its structures are wrong. What is its coalition? Who's it trying to appeal to? I think actually Brexit is not so much a cause of realignment in British politics. A realignment was happening, and the Conservatives were trying to appeal a bit to sort of Remainer Liberal Democrat areas in the south and red wall voters in the north. You probably got away with that when you could run on an anti-Jeremy Corbyn ticket, but much, much harder to run that game if you're just running on an anti-Keir Starmer ticket. So vast questions for the Conservative Party. I would say not, in my view, existential questions. For all that's been said, the Conservatives have come a clear second, are absolutely unambiguously the official opposition, and the ball starts in the court of whoever the next leader of the Conservative Party is to try and knock it into shape again. And if they do, voters will come back. That's the nature of politics.
There's an element of that I agree with, that, if you looked at where we were at a week, 10 days ago in the polls, an awful lot of people were thinking that Reform was going to come second and the Tories third.
And the Lib Dems could be the official opposition.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but
and
then
the Tories outpolled Reform.
A lot changed since then, didn't it? I think that, let's be honest, there was a campaign against Reform that was absolutely staggering. Really, I felt.
No, Reform at last came under some scrutiny. And the longer the campaign went on, the clearer it was that Nigel Farage doesn't like answering questions and doesn't like being asked to justify his stance. And I think he was exposed in that sense.
But when you say they came under scrutiny, which I don't doubt, by the way, they should, as should every party that's making promises and wants to represent us, so I have nothing against scrutiny. But are you seriously telling me that the amount of scrutiny that Reform was subjected to was the same equally as all parties? So, for example, you've got the likes of a Channel 4 doing undercover investigations. Do you think they did that into any other party other than Reform?
The Labour Party has faced massive scrutiny during this campaign. And, from the Tory party, we've faced a barrage of lies about what we intended to do once we were in government. The bit that's changed...
But that's from your political opponents, isn't it? And that is politicking.
Well, Reform are our political opponents, right? Whether you're a Conservative or Labour, they're fair game.
No, but the media have scrutinised all the parties. And I think it's clear Reform and Nigel Farage don't like it.
You honestly don't think that there was a campaign that was, for me, it felt like it was coming from all sides to try to attack and undermine Reform, whether it was the amount of time spent going through God only knows what historically, trying to dig up debt on candidates. I don't feel there was that much effort put into the rest of candidates on the slate. For example, we had... it feels so good now to be able to say candidates' names and the constituencies without feeling edgy that I'm about to spend 10 minutes reading out lists of people's names. Is so liberating. But, for example, you have the situation in your party where you had Jovan in Clacton, who described his favourite drink as being white man's tears. He said he was standing for black and brown people. And if Nigel Farage says my favourite drink is a pint of black man's tears, or I'm standing for the white man, he'd have been out that door quicker than a quick thing from Quickland. But it was glossed over.
Well, it wasn't. I remember discussing those comments on, I think it's on your show or on somebody's else. So it certainly was scrutinised. And Labour candidates...
He stayed in position.
Well,
It might have been
he didn't
discussed briefly.
He didn't fight an effective campaign.
He stayed in position and he was on the ballot as the Labour candidate.
Yeah.
If that was Nigel Farage that said, my favourite drink is black man's tears, he would not have been anywhere near standing.
But Michelle, you're not complaining about scrutiny. You're suggesting that different parties are held to different standards, which is a rather different thing. Scrutiny should be applied across the board. And you've just proven it was applied to the Labour candidate in Clacton, because we discovered his Twitter history.
I'm saying I have no issue with scrutiny. What I'm saying is I feel that there was an unfair campaign that focused desperately in on trying to undermine reform, where other parties didn't have that same level of, I would say to some element, conspiracy surrounding them.
I don't think it was a conspiracy. I mean, I think, look, the issue about the Reform Party, which I think made it interesting and a cause of legitimate inquiry, was, as Nigel Farage and Richard Tice confessed, it was a complete start-up party. So we didn't really know anything about their 600 candidates. So you had to go and find out. We knew a lot more about the Conservatives and Labour.
Don't tell me, it was so interested in this new start-up that we had nothing better to do than inform ourselves about them. I think there was a little bit more to it.
But there were so many more Reform candidates who bluntly were far-right extremists, supporting the British National Party, appeasing Hitler, someone saying that we should have, done a deal with Hitler in the Second World War. These are views that are way out of kilter with where the British public are.
And I think a lot of those stupid opinions were very swiftly dealt with, wasn't there? There was people removed from the party
there were a lot who weren't.
Very quickly. Let's listen to a clip from Nigel Farage, because there's a lot of conversation today about reforming the electoral system, and it's all to do with the amount of vote share that people got versus the amount of seats. So, for example, the Labour Party got 412 seats on about 34% of the votes. Lib Dems, they got 71 seats and their share was 12%. Reform got 5 seats with a higher share, 14%. Let's listen to what Nigel Farage had to say on that.
Show us some very interesting things. If we had proportional representation, we'd be looking at nearly 100 seats. But equally, first past the post inverts the other way, where Labour get almost the same number of votes they got, well, in fact, fewer votes they got under Corbyn, and yet 200 more seats. It is very much my view that our outdated first past the post electoral system is not fit for purpose, and we will campaign with anyone and everyone to change this electoral system.
What do you think to that, Mark?
He's got a point, and I'm unusual as a Conservative who actually is very open-minded to some form of electoral reform. The Conservative Party as a whole hasn't got much to complain about in these results. They've consistently supported the first past the post system, and if you live by it, you should die by it as well. But let me try and muster a case for the present system. It doesn't produce a completely fair result, it really doesn't. But it does produce, typically, it produces decisive results. And there is something to be said for that. That generally speaking, the biggest party, if it's sufficiently ahead of whoever's second, forms a government. And the people can be seen to have decided overnight. If you have a pure proportional system, you know what? Whether you go up 5% or down 5% doesn't make that much difference. And a government is always cobbled together in smokeless rooms, I should say, in today's world, between 4 or 5 political parties, and you get a mishmash. So I like the kind of clarity and the decisiveness of first past the post, but I worry that it is now, in a multi-party system, out of kilter, and I'd like to find some way of amending it such that at least the smaller parties who get a good chunk of the vote aren't necessarily propelled into government, but at least get something approaching a fairer chunk of the seats.
What do you think, Bill?
I'm a supporter of proportional representation, so in that sense I agree with Nigel Farage. But I think his critique of the Lib Dem performance is unjustified. One, the Lib Dems geographically concentrate their vote, and that is effective. Two, a big element of their vote was tactical.
Yeah, right.
So it actually represents much more than 13%. I know friends of mine are lifelong members of the Labour Party who happily voted Lib Dem last week, so it's more significant. But one of the major reasons that I'm in favour of PR, one, yes, it's clearly unfair if a party gets 15-20% of the vote and virtually no MPs, but it will stop what we've experienced for the last 14 years with the right wing of the Tory party dominating the government's agenda in government. Now, if we had PR, I'm not one of these people who thinks that that means the Tories would never govern. They would, but they'd be forced to the centre ground in order to win.
And do you think actually we just talked before the break about turnout and things, many people, because I've said this loads of times, I typically don't vote in general elections. I did this time, and I have the previous two because I was running in them. So I completely understand why people don't go out and vote. And this first past the post system, when you're saying, yes, it gives decisive results, it does also, the flip side of that is it makes you feel there's no point going out because in my seat, Labour will always win or Lib Dems will always win or whatever your seat is. And it stops that turnout.
Yeah, the truth of it, I mean, I hate to say this, in any individual case, Michelle, whether you vote or not doesn't make the damnedest bit of difference unless a candidate wins or loses by one vote and you'd voted for that candidate. So I don't believe that a proportional system would suddenly, everybody would think their vote counted. It doesn't especially matter if a given individual goes, yeah, your one vote would not have affected the election.
Well, not just
so it's more a question of civic duty.
But there'll be millions of people like me.
And the other argument that used to be made for electoral reform, which again I'm sympathetic to, was that there's vast numbers of safe seats across the country, and therefore the only votes that count are those in the 100 or so seats that are contested between the major parties. Well, the last two elections have proven that to be wrong. It seems that there is no such thing as a safe seat anymore. We've seen, safe Labour seats fall while they win a landslide majority. The Conservatives have gone from a comfortable majority to losing 2/3 of them. So I actually think your vote does count. And also, your engagement in the local political community counts. Not just a question of voting. If you actively support one candidate or another in your area, you can now make a meaningful difference.
Brian, on the website, he just got in touch and said, essentially, Michelle, 40% of the people didn't vote. They sat at home and they couldn't be bothered. So therefore, he says, Labour have won, so you reap what you sow. I don't actually think, Brian, it's a case of people couldn't be bothered. I know there will be some people like that, I don't doubt it. But I really don't think that's why a lot of people don't vote, just that they burn idle, quite frankly. I think it is a little bit more complicated than that. Diane says she does absolutely think the political system is unfair and needs change. Lots of people are actually saying exactly that same thing, that it's proportional representation that they want. Do you reckon it'll go to a referendum and that we'll be given a choice or not?
Well, unlikely, even though I'd probably welcome that. The problem is that the people who win under the system don't really have an incentive to change it. So although Bill's been very honest about his pro-PR tendencies, generally, if you benefit from the first-past-the-post system and win a colossal majority, discussions about reforming the system are put to one side. So it's quite difficult to actually get that done.
So there's no prospect of it happening
anytime soon
in this Parliament. But the reality is every electoral system has its flaws, its downsides and its drawbacks. The question moving forward is whether our multi-party system, which we do have now, is so fractured that it's not sustainable under first past the post.
Yeah.
And I think there's a compelling argument that it's not.
That's fair.
Someone on my website says, please can you talk about sectarian politics? I mean, we know what they're referring to there. We're referring to the people, the pro-Gaza activists, essentially, that got elected into Parliament. What do you think to that, Mark?
Yeah, this really caught me somewhat by surprise, actually, and it seems to have caught the Labour Party a bit by surprise. Two of their shadow cabinet, one of them, John Asworth, lost surprisingly. Wes Streeting nearly lost his seat. Didn't think anybody saw that coming. This is a problem for all mainstream political parties to combat this. I don't have an easy way of doing it, other than that all reasonable political parties need to be wholly united against it and prefer any one of the mainstream parties to win to any one of the sectarian parties to win. On the upside, George Galloway lost his seat, and I consider him to be a sectarian politician as well.
Best result of the night, in many senses, because he's a disgusting man who deliberately divides communities.
Well, a lot of people obviously like him, hence he won his seat there in the by-election, I guess.
Much lower turnout, and he was able to, it was overturned.
And Labour messed up in that by-election big time, yeah.
We had a flawed candidate that we then immediately disowned.
But a lot of people are very angry, aren't they, about what's going on in Gaza. They see the images of predominantly children, let's face it, getting maimed, killed. It's awful, it's horrendous. And a lot of people, that is the issue that is closest to their hearts. They feel more passionately about that than perhaps they do whatever it is that's going on the ground here.
And absolutely, and that sentiment has been weaponised by far left and extreme Muslim extremists who've weaponised the Gaza issue. Now, I think it was right that we had support for the State of Israel when they were horrifically attacked. It's also right that we call for an urgent ceasefire, but crucially that we politically move towards a two-state solution to resolve the conflict.
Did you see what happened with Jess Phillips?
Yeah, awful.
When she was basically announced as the winner, essentially, there was so much, I would call it aggression, basically, towards her. I thought it was really awful, actually, and I think she really held her own very, very well. And at one point, she even said to these people, ultimately, you don't like a strong woman standing up to you. And I think she was absolutely right.
I totally agree with her, and I think one of the really sad things in politics today is there's an awful lot of inadequate men who, for some reason, find it acceptable and necessary to challenge women in public life in atrociously crude terms.
I actually think it's more deeper than that, actually. I think that there are some people that have Islamist tendencies that actually don't think that women are equal to them. They would look at women as less than. And I find that quite a problem.
I think there's an element of that, but if you look at the abuse that women politicians and women in the media face almost on a weekly basis, it comes from across our communities and across the political.
It would be nice in our democratic politics if we could have a convention that people should be as noble in victory as they are gracious in defeat.
There was a lady at at the election party, the watch party last night, actually, and when that Jonathan Ashworth result was broken, basically, she said, she was a Jewish lady, and she said it made her feel really quite anxious because, of course, he lost to that pro-Palestinian independence. She said, as someone that was Jewish, that rising sentiment was really quite distressing to her.